you so much, Krista. And Krista, there are a couple of videos in this session. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to pause recording when we watch the videos and then start recording again. Because if you post them, I learned that's a copyright infringement. So who knew, right? Well, welcome everyone. I am thrilled to be here today to talk about poverty. This is kind of one of my passions in terms of educating people about equity and helping people understand how poverty impacts brain development and how it can potentially impact, the lives of children for the long term in terms of ACEs and things like that. So, we know as educators, you have a daily opportunity to impact the children and the families in your classroom, and you play a critical role in helping students along their journey. You guide them to discover their talents, and you inspire them to believe in themselves. And when we think about our interactions with our students who might experience poverty, if we're being honest with ourselves, sometimes it might be hard or more challenging to believe in them, to help them learn and even to guide them. But, we may also have those situations where they become our most treasured students, and they're on our hearts and in our minds long after our work with in the classroom with them ends. So as we work towards understanding equity, no matter what the social issue is, we might experience some personal discomfort, as this work does require us to look within ourselves at our own beliefs, our own values, and our own experiences. So I really just ask that not only today, as you engage in this first session, but as you engage in all of the sessions this month, that you just keep your mind open to new perspectives. And keep your mind open to the experience of others, because that's really where we learn and grow. In my educational training, my educational background, I did a lot of coursework in experiential education. So things like high ropes courses and similar challenges. And when I reflect on the work that I now do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, I realize that they're very similar experiences, because both experiential education and kind of putting yourself out there in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they require us to step out of our comfort zones and to learn. And so it's very true that that same requirement, it happens when we are dealing with matters of equity and social justice. So I just want to ask you today and throughout this month that you just kind of settle into that place of discomfort, because that's where true growth and true learning occurs. So as we spend our time together today, just think about the following. Just consider these questions. What are your own beliefs around the causes of poverty? So think about where those beliefs came from or how you learned them, okay? That does require us to take an honest look inside. And it can be painful, but that's where we take that first step towards learning and growing. And also consider your own experiences with poverty, even if you have lived experience or if you just have observational experience. I also just want you to think about, what you consider your relevant sources for facts about poverty. I've done this work for several years now. I do poverty simulations when we're not in a pandemic. And, a lot of people kind of have some misinformation about poverty or misunderstanding about people who experience poverty. So we always want to make sure that we're getting our information from credible sources. And then the final question just to consider is, if you are good at suspending judgment and assuming good intentions, and if you are capable of taking perspective. So again, this is difficult but very important work. And as we consider these things and our beliefs around them, the attitudes and actions towards all of our students can be impacted. So I did put in the chat box, I know we had some people join after I put it in, so I'm going to throw it back in there if I can navigate and find it. Okay, so in the chat box, I put in a PDF called the Hidden Rules Quiz. Now, we're not necessarily going to take this right this minute, but I would like to invite you to go ahead and open that document if you can. And I just want you to consider where you fall in the hidden rules. And you know what? I can actually probably share it on my screen. That might be helpful too. So this is actually some work that came out of, this is an activity that came out of some work that Ruby Payne has done regarding poverty and educating children who experience poverty. So I just want you to quickly take a look at that handout and just kind of identify what category you fall into. So consider if you could survive in poverty, and just quickly glance at these life situations and see if any of those apply to you. Maybe make a mental note or jot it down on a Post-it, how many of those you could check mark. I'm actually going to make my screen a little bit smaller. So when you're ready, you can move on to the middle class too. So make a mental note of how many of those middle class activities you know how to do that apply to you. And when you're ready, or after you've made your mental note of how many middle class boxes you can check, go ahead on and move to the wealth category and make a mental note of how many wealth life situations you could apply to your life. I'll give you just maybe one more minute to kind of wrap up your ideas on that. And as you're wrapping up, if you just want to share in the chat box, like one word about how this activity made you feel. One word about the hidden rules. Were you surprised about anything? Did you learn anything about yourself? Or you can unmute too if you just want to share. There's only 11 of us on, so I mean, I'll go ahead and just jump in. Even as a facilitator, I'm like, oh, this is a little cringy, right? To ask people, right, what their experiences are, right? Yeah, I would guess to say that many of us on this call were pretty comfortable with the middle class list there, right? Yeah, Marcia, this can make us very uncomfortable. Even if as a facilitator, I'm like, oh, people aren't going to like this, right? I actually really appreciate this activity for the main reason that it allows us to connect with our own lived experience first, which is really important before we can start connecting with the lived experience of others. Okay. So a lot of times when I do poverty simulations, people just don't get, I have even my own extended family members just don't understand why people who experience poverty, why they can't just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and, get on with their life, why they can't, go to college, or why they can't, make a house payment, or, afford to move out of, an apartment or whatever poor living situation they live in. And this activity kind of points out that sometimes there are skill sets that individuals who experience poverty, they might just not have ever been taught. They might not have ever learned. They might not have ever seen witnessed in their own lives. When we do the poverty simulation, we often point out that it always comes up that on the surface, it appears that individuals who experience poverty are very poor decision makers, because they'll have the big 70-inch TV, but they can't pay their electric bill, and that kind of imbalance kind of can create some bias, and it can create some frustration even from those of us who are on the outside looking in. But in many cases like that, individuals who experience poverty, they're living in the moment. They don't get the concept of saving for a rainy day, right? Or even saving for the utility bill, because who knows what can happen tomorrow. I could be out of work, I could lose my job, I could, have all sorts of life situation happen. So I'm going to live for today, and today the TV makes me happy. So I'm making that choice. So I apologize if that made you uncomfortable to get started, but I do think it's important that we first consider our own lived experience. Before we look at poverty more closely, I do want to just take a quick look at prevalence, because awareness is also the first piece. A lot of times we think we understand, and certainly as educators, you all are on the front line. You probably have a front row seat for this, for most of this, than most of us do. So you might really relate to some of this information, but I just want to give some kind of clarity to the prevalence of poverty. So we know that way too many people in the United States experience poverty, and most of them are children. About 11.9 million children, so that's 1 in every 6, live in some level of poverty. And research does show that children who are born into poverty, they do have difficulty achieving an education, and even earning a living wage down the road. So, and we'll talk a little bit about why that happens, and that really likely is not a huge surprise to any of you. So, some of the other underlying realities of poverty, and I think this is kind of surprises some people sometimes. But when we look at percent of annual household spending by income, you can see this graph has the top 20% of US wage earners, and then the bottom 20% of US wage earners. You can see that 1 in 5 working Americans spend at least 40% of their income on housing. And currently, there is no community in America, not a single one, where minimum wage earners can reasonably afford to pay rent. That is alarming, right? And to me, what that tells me is if we have parents of our children who are working minimum wage jobs, they are most likely, either really, really struggling, right? Or they're having to work multiple jobs to, put food on the table and keep a house, shelter over their heads. So this means they're probably less likely to to parent if they're just physically not there. And sometimes we make assumptions, right? I've certainly heard it before that, people don't deserve to, they need to work harder and get a better job and all of those things. But sometimes that's just not the reality. And that's not something that is an opportunity for many people. Before I worked in extension, I actually worked for 20 years in the healthcare field. And many of my staff members were CNAs who were minimum wage earners, right? And many of them were mothers and had children, and they were trying to balance and do all sorts of things, and they were good moms. And even though they would have full-time jobs, I would still on occasion have to write verification for benefits that they could get additional SNAP Ed benefits to put food on their table on the table. So even that experience opened my eyes. All right. So I also want to just talk about welfare just for a brief second, because sometimes we have this view of welfare that it's systemic and that people stay on it forever. But in many cases, welfare is used for survival. And it's simply because people have little to no options for earning livable wages with limited skills, education, and even literacy levels. So I have the 2018 federal poverty threshold up here, so you can see a family of four, that is $25,701. That hasn't changed since 2018. But I think this really surprises people. Nationally, the average welfare check for one parent and two children is $404 per month. How many of us could survive on $404 a month for essentially three people? Also, I think what's surprising to people is TANF, which is the temporary assistance for needy families. Nearly 80% of TANF recipients are children. So it does indicate that children are, in fact, the most vulnerable citizens in our country. The graph on the right just shows, you can kind of see, it's a graph that shows how long people spend on various welfare programs. So you can see there's kind of a gap, and I like to show this to people so they have this understanding. The vast majority of people who get assistance are on it for a month to 12 months, and then there's a kind of a break, and then you kind of have people who need more long-term assistance. And obviously this graph doesn't really cover why, but it helps us understand that not all people who receive assistance are on it for a long time. So, food insecurity is a huge thing too. Ask yourself, can you survive on $4.17 a day? Many of us probably paid that for our coffee this morning, right? I always drive by Starbucks and see that long line, and I'm like, oh my goodness, great that they're doing a business. And if you love Starbucks, awesome. More power to you. I'm a tea drinker, so every day I get 2 teas, cost me $2. That would be half of what I would get if I or would have eligible to spend if I was receiving SNAP benefits. So the average person receiving SNAP benefits receives a little over $4 a day, which works out to be about $1.40 a meal. And we know that many people who are receiving assistance, they work multiple jobs to make ends meet. They struggle, but they're still not able to make those ends meet. And so we kind of wonder, how does this apply to education or to brain development? And it really can be difficult, if not impossible, to succeed or advance in learning and to secure a better future for yourself if your basic needs are not met. Okay, you probably recognize this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure you all have seen it at some point in time. We're not going to spend any time on it, but academic achievement for children is low for families who struggle to meet their basic needs. That's just common sense, right? Applying what we know. And these cumulative realities of poverty often blur the vision of those living in it. So what happens is individuals who experience poverty, including children, it's almost as if they develop this mindset that their situation or their life experience is a personal deficiency, and that leaves them void of hope. And so the cycle continues, right? If I've never seen anyone succeed, if I've never seen anyone advance, then how can I advance, right? So we know that poverty affects education, it affects success, health, relationships, and really the ability for humans to develop to their full potential. So before we talk about how it affects the developing brain and then what we can do about that, I do just want to cover the different types of poverty, because sometimes we just think poverty is poverty, right? We don't really have an understanding of the different ways poverty can kind of display itself in our culture. So We have to understand as we move towards equity in our classrooms that not all poverty is the same lived experience. Poverty really is a umbrella term for many different types of life situations. So situational poverty, that's I don't want to say the most common, but the one that we can probably most identify with. So this is generally caused by a sudden crisis or loss, and it's often temporary. So people who experience situational poverty, they've often been surrounded by others who are educated, who earn a living wage. They've likely consistently had health care. So these events happen in their life. They cause them, to experience poverty. Those things could be like environmental disasters, divorce, or even severe health problems. But generally, people who experience situational poverty, they're able to make it back to middle class with some support. Then generational poverty, this occurs in families where at least two generations have been born into poverty. So families who live in this type of poverty, they're not equipped with the tools to move out of these situations. They might not have ever owned land or known anyone who's ever benefited from education. This group generally has pretty high illiteracy rates, and their main focus is just to make it through the day, right? To make it to the next day. Absolute poverty, this is pretty rare in the United States, but it can happen. It involves such a scarcity of necessities like shelter, running water, food. These folks, families who live this experience, are really just focused on day-to-day survival more so than generational poverty. We talked a little bit about working class poverty. This is where the adults are working, but they rarely have money for extras. So I'll just be transparent and say my child's fifth grade class, this is the last year they're doing Valentine's. We still have to write them out. We haven't done that yet. It's tomorrow. But as I was thinking about doing that later with him, I just had a moment and I wonder if there's anyone in his class that couldn't afford Valentine's this year, right? And I'm sure as teachers, you've had those experiences, where one child doesn't bring a snack in, or can't afford those little extras. People in working class poverty, they are living paycheck to paycheck. Few of them have adequate access to health care. Their focus is getting to the next paycheck or making it to the next month, right? So they have a little bit longer term focus than absolute and generational poverty. So the two final kind of classes of poverty are pretty self-explanatory. So urban happens in large urban areas of 50,000 or more people. With urban poverty, there's other complex social issues surrounding that, and additional stressors, including overcrowding and noise and generally violence in those situations. Rural poverty is something that we probably have more of in our area. And, this is often characterized by single guardian households, less access to services, less support for disabilities, some problems with getting a quality education. And there's many reasons, transportation's an issue out here. There might also be few opportunities for advancing. So I think it's important that as we consider equity, we also consider the different types of poverty. So let's talk about our kids. So children who experience poverty, they might believe the following about themselves and their families. They might have internalized feelings like nobody cares, nobody's going to help us, right? This was probably like one of the hardest slides I had to insert, because I certainly have worked with kids over my career who would fall into this category. And my heart just still goes out to them, to think of a child that doesn't have hope. It's just really hard pill to swallow. How we might also see this in the classroom, the children might feel like everybody else is smarter. Parents might ascribe to the mindset like people like us don't get ahead. They don't go to school. They categorize themselves into kind of an other group. They might also think, adults and children, they might think people who are making it or who have a good life, they are better than me somehow. And they might, again, feel that hopelessness. We don't have what we need to break the cycle. So it is hopeless. And we know that children who live in poverty are at greater risk for behavioral and emotional problems. So we might see things like impulsiveness, difficulty getting along with peers, aggression, attention deficit type things, and even different conduct disorders. So one of the reasons why, and I think what's super interesting, is poverty is not actually considered an adverse childhood experience, but it is a strong reinforcing factor in the accumulation of ACEs and toxic stress. So when children experience poverty, it's pretty likely that they have one or more of these other experiences also happening. So the presence of poverty can create an environment where an ACE can occur. So we know that when family stress increases, effective parenting decreases, and that definitely opens the door for exposure to potential ACEs. And just that exposure to that adversity alone causes stress that behaves as a toxin in the developing brain. So I just want to touch briefly on stress. And then I have a 60-second video that will talk about how stress impacts the developing brain. So when we think about ACEs and stress, there are 3 different types of stress to consider. So when we think about having a lot of work to do, multiple responsibilities, or just keeping all of the balls in the air, juggling, that's the type of positive stress. So youth might experience that as stressed about an upcoming assignment or a test, or even the first day of school. And positive stress is okay. We need some level of stress to help us learn how to perform, to build some resiliency in us, to help us develop some grit. That next level of stress is tolerable stress. And these tend to be a little bit more severe experiences in life, but they tend not to be long lasting. So things like a car accident, or even having someone close to you pass away, that could be considered a tolerable stress. And the experience of stress is lessened because there's a presence of a caring adult or an individual who helps the person get through that difficult time. But toxic stress is that prolonged, intense, frequent, chronic exposure to stress that creates the stress response in a child that delivers serious implications for their brain and body. So chronic stress does impact their developing brain. Poverty could be identified as a toxic or chronic stressor. So I do just want to take a minute to look at this video about how poverty can affect the developing brain. All right, re-recording, awesome. All right, that link is included in the resource sheet. So for those of you who are watching it later, you can watch that video. So, just if you caught it, I love that title, 60-second know-it-all, right? We don't need a big long video to tell us how poverty impacts the brain. There are 3 main areas that brain scans have shown and brain research has shown. The prefrontal cortex, underdeveloped, that's where we make our decisions, that controls our impulses. That's where our attention is centered. So that tends to be underdeveloped in children who experience poverty. The amygdala, that's kind of the emotional center of our brain. Being able to control our fear response, being able to process our emotional reactions can be impacted. We often see this manifested as an increased anxiety or proneness to being fearful in youth. And then finally, that hippocampus, which that's responsible for learning, memory, and some type of stress response regulation. So this is often displayed as impaired memory and even mood control. So we know bad things, right? It's not just what they're experiencing in terms of not being able to feel safe and secure. It's having a physical impact on how their brain develops. So let's talk about moving towards equity. Okay. Because that's really what we want to do. Now that we know this, how do we improve the lives of the kids that we work with every day? Okay. So Krista, are we able to do like a quick breakout room? Can you just manually look? I think we're going to do that. Like, let's do it. Let's see what happens. Okay. So just randomly assign two to a room and let's chat for 4 minutes. Okay. And I'll give you, I'll put in the, I'll put in the chat box so you could take it to the room with you. So what I want you to do with your partner in your room, I just want you to talk about how your experience and exposure to opportunities while growing up are similar or different than the students and families that you serve. Okay? So go ahead and open the breakout rooms. 4 minutes. Are we good? Okay. We'll see. Yeah. Welcome. Is everybody back? Looks like everybody's back. So does anybody just kind of want to give a little recap about something that they talked about or a point that was made?
Someone from the maintenance department, please make sure
Oh,
that
it's like, okay, cool. Maintenance, right? Does anybody want to just jump in?
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go, Gail.
One of the things that we talked about is with looking with us, it's age related and time, because my partner was 56 and I'm 72. So things were different back when we were younger, but we had more ways to make accommodations, like what, and we had very large gardens. And we had a smokehouse and we had chickens and so we didn't worry about food. But we did worry about people coming in and repossessing our furniture.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Gail. I think, Marcia, did you want to share something too?
I just said that, right from the very get-go, my father came from severe poverty, but his dad came up from Mexico and got a job on the railroad. So he was able to provide, and then my dad got a really good job at the mill. So he was able to provide. My mom was a nurse. So right from the very beginning, my parents, well, Marcia's going to be a nurse too. And our sons are going to go to college. And it just was an expectation, it just seemed like there was a continuation of the American dream, little by little. I mean, we didn't have money by any means, but we did, my parents had a car, and even when we got to a certain age, they were able to buy one for all of us just one for us all to share. So, I mean, it was scrimping and saving. We didn't have a lot of money, but there was an expectation that you worked hard, and that you could do it. So,
yeah. Yeah. So again, anytime we think about equity on any level, whether it's, gender equity or racial equity or ability, I think it's really important to consider what our lived experience was, so we can consider how we can best connect to those that we're trying to extend equity to. So I thank you for kind of engaging in that. And I also just wanted to share, I told Krista before y'all got on, I'm like, oh my gosh, I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours because I'm so passionate about it. I was a child of poverty, but I didn't know it. So my parents did a great job at, shielding me from those stressors. I know it now as an adult, and looking back, I can point out and see, okay, this is where things could have really gone south. But today really is meant to be kind of this starting point. And a lot of times when I give these presentations, especially to educators, I'm like, I want to be able to swoop in and say, okay, do this. Here's your checklist. Do that, do this, do that. Because I know y'all need an easy button, right? I know your plates are really full. But I'm telling you, anything with diversity and equity and inclusion work, it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? And you have to you always have to dig a little deeper, and you always are learning. Learning with this topic just will never be done. So hopefully today, we can give you some great resources. And we'll talk about resources in a minute. So I just want you to think about I have safety first on here, but in the chat box, I just want you to share a word or two when you think of what a safe classroom is. So share a word or two about what you think a safe classroom is. Okay, so what compromises a safe classroom? All included? Accepted? There's no wrong answers here, by the way. Stable, caring, absolutely. Yep, great. Participate without being judged, relationships, respect, right? One of my favorite kind of just mantras just in life in general, when I think about the work that I've done across my career, is that I want to be able at the end of the day to say that I treated everyone with dignity and respect, right? That's kind of just my personal mantra. Okay, so let's do the converse of that. Think about a classroom that makes you feel unsafe. So what are some characteristics of that classroom? So characteristics of unsafe classrooms. Yeah, judgmental. Look down on, lack of control, extreme sarcasm. So again, these could be difficult questions, right? Pointing out flaws. Yes, all of those things. And when we think about safety, obviously, we think of physical safety, but we also need to be concerned about emotional safety. So moving towards a culturally responsive classroom, no matter the topic, means that the classroom space needs to be a space where students are seen, valued, and cared for, and respected as their full and complete selves. Okay. And we're going to take a look at some research-based theories on how people move out of poverty, or how to help people move out of poverty, as well as associated best practices for educating students. I love this picture. It's probably my favorite picture in the whole slide deck. So first, we think about taking a strengths-based approach. So this can help build equity in our classroom. So by focusing on the strengths of each student, you empower them by focusing on their goodness, what they do know, rather than what they don't know, and the skills that they have. And I'm a huge fan. I have to take a strengths-based approach with one of my children pretty much every single day, right? Because he lacks confidence. He's just not a confident kiddo. So every day I'm finding something to point out, like, oh, you know how to do that. How awesome is that, right? Not, you didn't do this. Okay, so even just some subtle changes in our verbiage and how we interact can start building that bridge to equity. So this means looking for the good. So this looks like, I believe in you. I know that you're smart. I know that you can learn more. I know that you can XYZ. You can graduate high school. You can go to college. I know that you can fulfill your dreams. Because remember earlier when we talked about poverty, there tends to be this lack of hope, right? And this personal deficiency. I'm not good enough. This doesn't apply to me. So we'd want to focus on things that can be contributed rather than what can't be contributed. Of course, we want to be welcoming and encouraging. That key to building resilience in students is being that one person that's absolutely crazy about them, right? I'm so glad you're here today. I'm so glad to see you. That really goes a long way in achieving that goal of making the student feel wanted and valued. And really, working on our ability to display empathy instead of sympathy. And, Brene Brown has done tons of work on empathy. I actually have just recently, I'm probably behind the times, but I've signed up for her podcast, and I'm gonna go back and listen to all her podcasts on empathy. But, having people feel sorry for you is not a good feeling. It's not an empowering feeling, right? So we want to focus on those steps towards empathy as well. Okay, so the next approach, you might have heard the saying, no one is an island or no man is an island. So we need to have an understanding that students need support and no one does everything by themselves. So this is something that's called the asset theory. And I don't know, Sterling schools might be doing some of the 40 developmental assets. I know that was a focus for a while. You might be familiar with the 40 developmental assets. If not, there's a resource on the resource sheet for you to familiarize yourself. But the idea is to focus on learning about what assets the student has. So it's kind of similar to strengths-based approach, but also learning the assets of their family, but then pairing it with what they need to move forward. So, it does focus on strengths. So, having this understanding that diversity in thought and culture and traits are positive assets. So again, we need to focus on what each student brings into the classroom, not what they lack. So, this might also mean learning about what community resources are available to connect families to. And I tell teachers this all the time, or educators, really you just need to know 3 numbers. 211 is probably your best friend. So if someone's struggling with energy assistance, they could simply call 211, give their zip code, and 211 would link them to agencies that provide energy assistance. Now, we're not social workers. Our plates are already full. We're not adding more to our plate. But when we see those opportunities to help push a family ahead, we should be prepared to help out where we can. So this might also mean having or helping students and families navigate the middle class world. Now, if you and I grew up kind of in the middle class world where we knew how to sign up for Little League and how to access, certain resources and services, we might have this assumption that people just know how to do those things, right? When that might be a failed assumption. So, we might need to help support, in pointing people in the right direction, helping them complete paperwork, or teaching them how to ask the right questions. We could even consider teaching students how to ask questions. And that could be incorporated into any of the lesson plans that we do, right? Because when we ask questions, that's the main way to gain access to information. And that can be an invaluable skill down the road, right? So when a barrier comes up, we're teaching a student how to seek additional resources to overcome that barrier. And we know that research has demonstrated that students who couldn't ask questions, they experience more academic troubles. Okay, so the next foundation is one of my favorite research-based theories. It's the resiliency theory. And I love, if there is only one video that you watch on the resource sheet, I hope it's by Linda Cleat Wyman. I have a TED Talk included, or her TED Talk included on the resource sheet. She's a school principal at a school that experiences very high poverty rates. And every single morning in her announcements, she says this. She announces this to the entire school. I love you, essentially, is what she's saying to them. This is kind of the cornerstone of the resiliency theory. It's rooted in the idea that people can build resiliency when they're surrounded by others who tell them what is good about them. Okay, so make a point to share what's special about each student. Again, focusing on their uniquenesses and their strengths. We can also incorporate into our lesson plans tasks that require perseverance, right? And then we kind of backfill in that with that message of, I believe in you. I knew you could do it. Look what you did, right? Building that confidence, building that resilience. So designing and promoting lessons that promote perseverance, even incorporating opportunities to teach students how their brain works and how they can use that information to grow as learners. And then the other kind of key to this theory is using our words. The words that we use are powerful. So calling students by name, acknowledging their presence, it goes a very long way because we all want to be noticed. we all want to be important. And this also means we have to watch our nonverbals. Okay. So, because our nonverbals can communicate judgment, right? And students pick up on this. So, deeply question your intent so it's accurately reflected in your tone and in your gestures. Okay. So, just a couple, I think one more actually, strategy with some associated best practice. So connections are important to people because that's how people create and build success, when they know the right people. So individuals who experience poverty, they can benefit from developing trusted relationships with people who have benefited from education. Remember, it's kind of like that role model effect, if you will. So building social capital should also be something that we consider in our classrooms. So this might mean bringing in former students, older students who have benefited from education, because we really want students to see themselves in others so they can believe in themselves, right? And there's tons of documentaries and short videos on people who experienced poverty as children and grew up to have major successes in life. So, we can incorporate those into our lessons plans. We can do journal articles or journaling related to watching those videos, or even assign a project, a classroom project, depending on the age of your student. Okay. Also, how we can build social capital is by ensuring that our classroom is as collaborative as possible. So using strategies just like paired assignments or cooperative groups, that again, that helps reinforce making those connections when and where you can. Awesome. So just a few more minutes. So I want to ask you, what's the why? Because oftentimes, especially when we work with children who experience poverty in their families, it can be easy for us to assign motives to their behavior. We think very little about the actual why. We fail to discover the deeper meaning behind the behavior. So again, assuming best intentions, right? People are doing the best they can with the information, the perspectives, and the resources they have. This requires us to take that hard look at ourselves, right? And kind of doing that heart check. Are we coming from that right place? Are we coming from that place of helping? Or are we coming from that place of judgment? And I'll be the first to admit, some days it's easier to come from that helping place than others, right? We wouldn't be human if we didn't have that experience. So have an honest reflection with yourself and even with others about your own biases, right? So we also really can go behind the behavior by eliminating phrases like these kids or these parents. Hopefully that's not happening, but even in our own internal dialogue, that can happen, right? We could think, oh, well, those kids never get that done, and that never, that's not helpful. So remember that your experiences, your worldview is likely different from the students that are in your care, and work towards understanding their perspective. So to do that, because you're educators, you all are experts in interacting with your children and building them up, and giving them the tools and resources. What I think sometimes we need assistance with is that perspective piece. So I really wanted to focus today on some tools to bridge the gap. And they're not like, curricula or do this strategy. It really takes some deeper reflection. So what I included on the resource sheet, is a whole list of print resources, books, and then my favorite, literally, I went down this huge rabbit hole with all these videos. I think I watched videos for 4 or 5 hours while I was developing this, because I'm like, oh, that one's good too. And that one's good too. So there's a couple of TED Talks in there that I'd like to highlight: the How to Fix a Broken School, Everyone Needs a Champion, The Brain on Poverty. I think that is to come. You know what? I'm going to put this in the, Krista, you saved the chat, correct? Okay. Yeah. I'm going to put my most recommended, and Krista does have the resource sheet, so that will be to come. These are my top, I don't know, 10, how many ever there are, videos on that resource sheet to get you started. Because again, the goal today was to get you thinking about how equity and poverty are experienced in your classroom. So I wish I had that magic wand to wave to say, boom, your classroom is now an equitable space. That would be lovely, right? But with all types of social justice efforts, it does take work, but it's important, it's valuable, and it's life-changing work. And it is not something that just takes an hour. It takes that continued learning and growth. So hopefully this list of resources can be useful to you. And hopefully too, we can explore this topic further with continued learning. One, I know Marcia, I was in a room with her and we talked a little bit about Ruby Payne and a lot of her work. I don't know if anyone's ever read Eric Jensen. He is another researcher on poverty in kids. He has a lot of great books out there with strategies. Those are also listed on the resource sheet. So I just wanted to close out and just say that, you can make a difference. You are making a difference. You can increase equity and influence outcomes. Today is just a start of that work. So again, access those resources provided, continue learning in this topic. There's no easy answers, but with this commitment, I hope that you're empowered to look at the children in your classroom through a new lens. And you certainly have the foundation and the tools that you need to make a difference. So I know I always go right up to the time because I just love this. And hopefully we can connect over this or similar topics in the future because it really is that important. So I'm going to turn it back to Krista.
Right. Thank you so much, Carla. Yes, these are such important conversations. We're just getting started, really thinking about all of our kids and how we can build on their strengths and help them succeed and have equity and access to their learning. So any day we get to spend with Carla is a good day. So thank you to all of you. If you ever have the opportunity to do Carla's poverty simulation, I think that was probably the most meaningful time I've spent in a long time. So it just gives you great perspective as to what our families that are living in poverty, what they're feeling and experiencing, just really good perspective. So I highly recommend that. And thank you so much, Carla. And thank you to all of you. Quick plug, the next 2 Thursdays, we'll continue our equity series. So same bat channel, same bat time, next Thursday at 3 o'clock. Join us again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.